Ladies and gentlemen, one more round of applause for the real star of the show, Emily Mullen. All right. Before we get started, I'd also like to pay a quick thank you to the folks at Addressing Gettysburg back there who are recording the show. And so if you weren't able to make it to any programs before, or if you can't make future ones, please go onto their YouTube page, watch the different presentations here today. We asked them very last minute, as probably come as a surprise to you folks, but a lot of this is very last minute, and so it's a team effort, right? You know, they say that you can plan all you want, but when the bullets start flying, those plans go right down the drain, right? So we're happy to have you all folks out here today on this beautiful, cool spring day and sitting here in these lectures. So, all right, so I got 1 o'clock exactly, so that's time for us to get started here. The boss says make it fairly quick, so that's what I'm going to try to do. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Gettysburg National Military Park. My name is Danny Brennan, and I'm one of the seasonal rangers here. For much of the anniversary thus far and in the future, I've been on traffic control for this, our anniversary lecture series. So you might recognize me as the person demanding to see your ticket and perhaps giving you various announcements throughout the day. So I'm very honored to step back from that role for the next 45 minutes to an hour or so and be able to speak in front of you about a group of often overlooked individuals who participated in and witnessed the fighting here at Gettysburg. A battle which occurred 163 years ago today, yesterday, and tomorrow. Now, whether you're new here or a veteran visitor, chances are that when you think of the battlefield, most often you'll be thinking about the fighting men of the armies. So these are officers, the different leaders of units giving men commands and leading them into the fight. There are also the enlisted men, the common soldiers, as well as the different units that they're a part of. In other words, you think of these fighting men more than anything else. And you can't be blamed for this, because early preservationists on the battlefield have made it so that you're surrounded by iconography to these different people. Of the around 1,300 plus monuments, markers, and tablets on the battlefield, almost all of them are to fighting men. Whether they're generals on horseback like General Henry Warner Slocum up there, or individual regimental monuments like further to the right, the soldiers of the 7th Ohio Infantry who come from around my hometown. But there are more to the battle and armies than the men who shouldered the rifle, carried the artillery implements, and issued the orders of war. There are also men whose job it was to support and sustain all of these men throughout many years of the conflict. Those men took on many different types of roles, but one of the most common was that of the regimental chaplain. The stories of Civil War chaplains are not untold in history. Untold is a word that's used to sell histories to you, whether it be a program or a book or whatever. Well, chaplains are told. And in fact, 2 of the monuments on this battlefield are markers to different individuals who had this role during the battle. One that you can see in downtown Gettysburg, another which you can see just off of Hancock Avenue. However, chaplains' experiences are little told and often misunderstood. In the 21st century, we think of this role as men and women who have very organized tasks. They know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. They know the requirements issued to them. And they also know exactly how to serve the men and women in the armed forces. But in the 19th century, things were a little bit more different than that. The chaplaincy role was less organized, and individuals had to decide for themselves how they would carry out that role. Chaplains were supposed to be religious ministers, and so things like prayer and spiritual wellness certainly played into what they did. But if they were good at their jobs, they also tended to the more material, the more temporal needs of the different soldiers in their day-to-day lives. The many ways they decided to do this make for a very interesting chapter in the story of the American Civil War. That is why today for this program, I want to tell you a story of the Battle of Gettysburg that you're perhaps unfamiliar with. To walk you through the 3 days of fighting here on this, the anniversary, by looking through the perspectives of individual chaplains, particularly the chaplains that made up the Union Army. But before we delve into the actions in July 1863, I want to give some context into the many roles that chaplains took on during the war. Chaplains have been around in U.S. history since the very start, since 250 years ago at the American Revolution, as we celebrate the 4th of July coming up. They played a role in the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the U.S.-Mexican War. But it wasn't until the Civil War that the chaplaincy role really exploded, in large part because the Army had regulated that each individual regiment was allowed one man to serve in this role. There was very little that these individuals were given in regards to what was expected of them or the requirements for getting the role in the first place. The only real stipulation was that they were a regularly ordained minister. First, being a Christian denomination, but in July 1862, any religious denomination was allowed chaplains. And that was only really manifested in the form of different Jewish chaplains during the war. They were also, during their service, supposed to be given and writing a morale report for their individual regiments. But whether they wrote these reports and issued them or not is up for debate, as many of them, if they were ever written of these reports, do not survive today. And so, Civil War chaplains, whether Protestant, Catholic, or in rare cases Jewish, largely had to carve out their own ministries during the war. This meant the around 2,400 Union and 1,300 Confederate chaplains across multiple different theaters had approximately 3,700 different approaches to the service. Sometimes the decisions they made these chaplains quite against some of the soldiers they fought with and under. It angered them. This brings us to our very own George G. Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac here at Gettysburg, who well after his victory here lashed out at chaplains as a group, saying that there were those who do nothing and others who, in his words, made themselves obnoxious by interfering in matters they have no business with. But while chaplains may have been at the ear of some, others earned the respect of the men around them. And this was often by centering soldiers and their different needs. They did so by doing things like improving spirituality, something that were perhaps not unexpected when it came to the chaplains. So this was saying prayers, leading worship ceremonies, giving sermons, and for liturgical denominations, also giving out sacraments. There was also the task to improve morality, which for chaplains included speaking out against gambling, drinking, and whatever they believed to be a certain vice. To do so, sometimes they organized temperance societies, so to prevent men from drinking, and encouraging men to use their money not for gambling, but instead donating to different poor groups in the United States, and in some cases, even places as far off as Ireland. But then there were more material aspirations of these men, as they tended to the different soldiers' belongings. One of the most common roles for the chaplains was acting as the regimental postmaster. Meant that they sent and received the different mail of the men in their units so that they could effectively have a nice connection between the home front as well as the war front. Some men took in other things than the mail. And in fact, Father William Corby, perhaps the most famous chaplain here at Gettysburg, you could find in his files a small book, 101 pages in length, that's a ledger for all of the deposits that men in his unit gave him that he later protected and sent off home. But then there was the role of chaplains that William Eastman of the 72nd New York articulated. And that was that a chaplain was to be one man, to be a friend to every man. In other words, this is a catch-all term. It meant that they were supposed to be present and willing to hear out their men, whether in their the highest highs or their lowest lows. They were supposed to be around them during and before battles, encouraging the men to do their duties, leading them in prayer before battle, treating the dead and dying with dignity. In short, these men were to prepare the soldiers how to fight and even die, if so necessary. Of course, one of the great battles that chaplains played a role in is the Battle of Gettysburg. We have records of 110 and 128 chaplains, Confederate and Union, 110 Confederate, 128 Federal chaplains. The experience of the Confederate chaplains, I believe, deserves a talk in its own right. But time and narrative will focus today on the experiences of the Union chaplains, those who donned the blue uniforms and served the U.S. Army. Within that group of Union chaplains were 13 different denominations represented. The most common being the Methodists, who had 32 different chaplains here. This was in large part because Methodism was becoming a very popular faith in the United States in the aftermath of an event known as the Second Great Awakening, an evangelical fervor that brought men into the Methodist Church. Northern Methodist leaders encouraged their ministers to join the ranks of the Union Army, and so hence why there were so many of them. But Methodism wasn't the largest denomination in the U.S. at the time. That instead, with the arrival of various immigrants from other countries, was Catholicism. And so because of that, you may be surprised to find out that only 2 Catholic priests served as chaplains in the Union Army. This in large part was because bishops and other Catholic leaders wanted their priests back home rather than out with the army. But when all was said and done, there were approximately 144 United States regiments without chaplains here at Gettysburg, a majority of the forces here. Those that were here reflected a diversity not only in denomination, but also in what they decided to do over the course of the fighting. And so, their experiences will make for a good way to describe the whole Battle of Gettysburg. Indeed, the story of how those 128 plus men got to South Central Pennsylvania in the first place may be one that's familiar to all of you. A month after the May 1863 Battle of Chancellorsville, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had taken his victory there, became emboldened, and then marched his troops up in hopes of securing a victory on loyal Union northern soil. Not long after, the Union Army of the Potomac pursued. Both armies used different roads to get to their objectives, including some of the 10 different roads that came into the town of Gettysburg. It was at that major crossroads where the armies met, not recognizing that they were about to fight the bloodiest battle in U.S. history. The Battle of Gettysburg opened on the early morning of July 1st, when Federal cavalrymen or horse soldiers under General John Buford faced off against some Confederate infantrymen under Henry Heath. With Buford's command, his division was a single chaplain in the form of a 56-year-old Episcopal priest, a chaplain who likely stayed well off to the rear. Over the course of the morning fighting, soldiers from the 1st Army Corps continued to the fighting on the west of town, so the left-hand side of the map, and then soldiers from the Union 11th Army Corps brought the fighting to the north of town, or the very top of the map. As those infantrymen, or those foot soldiers, came into town, they brought chaplains with them, most of whom stayed off to the rear. But then there were some chaplains who decided to go in with the men in the fight, to personally serve them where it was hottest. And that includes Chaplain Ferdinand Sarner of the 54th New York Infantry, a man who decided to serve his men while in the front. Sarner is a very interesting figure in the Civil War. He was the only Union Jewish chaplain here at the battle. A native of Germany, he settled into Rochester, New York, where he gained permission from a senior rabbi to eventually join the ranks in the Union Army, which he did so in April 1863. His unit, the 54th New York, was a mostly German command, one that didn't seem like an appropriate place for a chaplain, given that many of the men in the ranks were free thinkers, religious skeptics, agnostics, and in some cases even atheists. But over time, those men learned to respect Rabbi Sarner for his intellectual bent and his personal bravery. That bravery came out here at Gettysburg. The 54th New York occupied a piece of high ground to the north of town known as Bloucher's Knoll, which has gone down in history as Barlow's Knoll because of the division commander of which the 54th New York was a part. At some point in the day, they were overwhelmed by Confederate forces from the Confederate Second Corps, men from Georgia, Louisiana, and North Carolina, who overwhelmed their line and sent them retreating in the rear. During the heaviest of action, Chaplain Sarner was seen riding on his horseback, encouraging the men, before he himself received a wound and his horse shot right from under him. He survived the battle here, and he eventually was discharged late in 1864. But the records are unclear if he rejoined the Army after his injury here. A decade later, he died from yellow fever while serving as a rabbi down in Tennessee. As troops began fighting to the west and eventually north of town, medical personnel of the 1st and 11th Corps set up field hospitals in the town of Gettysburg to take care of some of the wounded from the very lines that men like Sarner joined the fighting men in. Some 1st Corps doctors took over the Christ Lutheran Church just on the Chambersburg Street, about a block away from the town diamond. It was a good location. Its proximity to the road allowed wounded from the 1st Corps to come in, sit on some of the pews, and in total, about 140 wounded were taken care of by some of the different surgeons. In the hospital that day was also a chaplain, the Reverend Horatio Howell. Howell served as a 42-year-old Presbyterian minister who was well educated and had served in a small church in northeastern Pennsylvania. In March 1862, he joined the 90th Pennsylvania as their chaplain. Here at Gettysburg, Howell did what most regimental chaplains did, and that was stay with the medical personnel at hospitals to care for the different wounded, to pray with them, to give them comfort for what was to come. While initially these hospitals were in a relatively safe position away from the battlefront, over the course in the late afternoon of the 1st, the town of Gettysburg and the field hospitals which were in them also became a part of the battleground. He heard some firing, Howell did, as Federal soldiers began their retreat through the crowded streets of the area. Hearing this firing, Howell walked outside, right after remarking to a surgeon, "I will step outside for a moment and see what the trouble was." And so the chaplain walked out the door. He would have been able to see blue-clad soldiers in a panicked retreat, trying their best to get off to safety. Right on their heels were the gray-clad Confederates, trying to pick off whatever target they could possibly find. One such target was none other than Chaplain Howell. In December 1861, the U.S. War Department recommended that chaplains wear a plain felt or forage cap, a simple black frock coat, and black pants. But as suggestions go, not every man followed through on this. Chaplains chose for themselves what they wanted to wear. Although chaplains were not considered commissioned officers, they received the same pay as captains. And so some men very proudly wore the uniform of an officer, as you could see very well presented in this wonderful Photoshop job I did over here. Worked quite hard on that. That's not a real picture, folks. I mean, I know it's hard to believe. But so they had the shoulder straps. They had the sword by their side. And as this photo so accurately represents, Howell was one of those men. Howell was one of those soldiers who wanted to look like a fighting man, even if his role was sustaining those soldiers. Well, as he was out on the steps of Christ Lutheran, a Confederate soldier saw Howell. He was not able to tell the difference between captain and chaplain. So he leveled his gun at the chaplain and called out for him to surrender. Howell attempted to offer what one witness described as some dignified explanation to the effect that he was a non-combatant, and as such, he was exempt from capture. The Confederate replied to this by shooting the man right in front of him, killing him instantly, justifying his decision by the fact that he had the shoulder straps and he had the sword right by his side. Howell was eventually taken back to Brooklyn, New York, where he's buried in a very famous location known as Greenwood Cemetery, alongside many Civil War veterans. He was the only chaplain killed here at Gettysburg, and his experience demonstrates one where he found himself accidentally on the battleground. Union soldiers in their retreat through town left Howell's body, at least initially, where it fell. Rather than leave the Gettysburg area, however, they settled on the high ground to the south of town. Through the end of the first day into the beginning of the second, more units streamed in to fortify the Union line on the high ground and make it into the shape of a fishhook. With these new arriving units were more chaplains on the field. Among the chaplains to arrive between the first and the second were the two Catholic priests with the Army. One in the 3rd Army Corps, positioned along the Union left wherever their Corps commander decided they would be at that time, if you know what I mean. And another, there you go. And another with the Union 2nd Corps, positioned along the slopes of Cemetery Ridge. Now, practitioners of Catholicism, I want to step back here and explain this, could be found in most Union regiments. There are certain culturally Catholic units, primarily Irish units here, but they could be found in pretty much, and I would even go so far as to guess, every Union unit here, at least in some capacity or another. And so having just 2 chaplains to minister to thousands of men of any particular denomination would be a challenge. But it's especially difficult for Catholics, a religion who place so much emphasis on sacraments, on getting certain practices so that a person could have their souls cleared before they went off into battle. Well, one of the Catholic chaplains here was a 29-year-old Detroit native by the name of Father William Corby, a man of recognized talents who rose up in the ranks of his alma mater, the University of Notre Dame, before mustering in as chaplain of the 88th New York Infantry in December 1861. At Gettysburg, Corby was the only chaplain with the famed culturally Catholic Irish Brigade. Usually, his preference would be to administer sacraments to individual soldiers, especially the sacrament of confession or penance, where soldiers came up to him, told them their sins, and then eventually had their souls cleared into battle. But in the rush of the fight, he understood that these individual sacraments were logistically impossible. And so, either during a time of rest for the Irish Brigade, or just as they had received orders to go into battle, Corby called together the men in prayer. According to an 1879 letter he wrote, he started talking to his men by saying, "In consideration of the want of time for each one to confess his sins in due order, as required for the reception of the sacrament of penance, I will give you general absolution." Now, what does Corby mean by this? What is general absolution? Well, general absolution is a prayer that soldiers would listen to and pray along with. If they were truly sorry for their sins, their wrongdoings, then the Catholic theology goes that they would be totally forgiven for them. As I keep saying, their souls cleaned before they went off into battle, perhaps their last fight. Watching this prayer, where by all accounts the soldiers of the Irish Brigade got down on their knees in prayer, was some Protestant leaders, such as the 2nd Corps Commander, General Winfield Scott Hancock. Another person was the chaplain of the 145th Pennsylvania, a Lutheran who, seeing this grand spectacle, went off to his own colonel and asked if they might be able to say a prayer before their fight. Corby's absolution on July 2nd, 163 years ago today, probably not too far along from where we're talking about now, a couple hours away, has gone down as undoubtedly the most famous action by a chaplain here at Gettysburg. And so over time, it has been heavily mythologized. Indeed, there are 3 different accounts of the absolution from its start to its finish, with many more references in other documents. 2 of the 3 accounts came from Father Corby. Another was written by the lieutenant colonel commanding the 116th Pennsylvania of the Irish Brigade, St. Clair Mulholland. Mulholland said that Corby said to his men, "The Catholic Church refuses Christian burial to the soldier that turns his back upon the foe or deserts the flag." However, Corby's earlier recollection, that 1879 letter that I quoted from before, made no mention of this line. When the priest published his memoirs in the 1890s, he copied Mulholland's account almost verbatim, but noticeably left out that one line. Instead, Corby added that he said the prayer for every soldier who heard it. It didn't matter if they were Protestant or Catholic. It didn't matter in Corby's retelling if they were Northern or Southern. Because on that day, he meant to inspire the men before their fight, before their battle. After the war, Corby served as a 2-time president of the University of Notre Dame. He was even responsible in his 2nd term for constructing the very famous Golden Dome there. He died in 1897 as the head of his religious order in the United States. And his story here demonstrates one that tied sacramental inspiration unique to Catholics and prayerful inspirations common to most chaplains. Corby's significance came in his service to fighting men before their big fight. Men like Howell served these fighting men after the battle. Others like Ferdinand Sarner followed the men into the fight but did not fire a weapon. But there were a few chaplains who not only followed the men but also fought as a fighting man. This brings us to Chaplain Lorenzo Barber of the 2nd United States Sharpshooters, a man who was known to have very powerful sermons that were well attended. But this Methodist preacher was more known for his willingness to fight. And in fact, his men affectionately known him as the Fighting Parson. In fact, the historian of the 1st and 2nd United States Sharpshooters, a very elite regiment, a set of regiments in the war that required a test in order to even be in the unit, referred to Barber as one of our best marksmen. Another veteran summed up his feelings for him by saying, "The chaplain practices what he preaches. He tells us what we should do and goes with us to the very front to help us in battle." On the way up to Gettysburg, while his unit in the 3rd Army Corps was in Emmitsburg, Barber had the regiment's mailbag, once again acting as the regimental postmaster, as was so common for the chaplaincy. Well, at some point, he found himself amidst an enemy cavalry patrol, a patrol who captured him. But as his regimental historian later recalled, he succeeded in effecting his escape, although he lost the mail which was rifled in his presence. In lieu thereof, he brought along with him 2 prisoners, However, he managed it. So let's step back for a minute. Not only did this guy escape from the enemy, but he also managed to capture 2 prisoners with him along the way. Now, I can't think of a more exciting story than that, whether it's true or not. Now, there's some reason to believe that Barber was not able to manage his escape until after the fighting here at Gettysburg. It might have been a couple days after the conclusion of the fight before he left, although we can't know for absolute certain. But what we do know is that his military flock did fight here along the star that I have on the map. The 2nd U.S. Sharpshooters were some of the first troops to see heavy action on July 2nd. As soldiers, Confederate soldiers of John Bell Hood's division, men from Arkansas, Texas, Alabama, and Georgia were set to attack the Union left. It's the elite sharpshooters who were the first line of resistance in this effort. While perhaps not here, Barber fought just over 4 months later when he was wounded in a skirmish around Mine Run, Virginia. He recovered, but when he rejoined his regiment, he decided not to continue as a fighting man, settling as a preacher rather than a fighter. He ultimately left with his unit in February 1865. After the war, he continued to practice with his rifle as a post-war preacher in Troy, New York. But in 1874, during a routine hunting trip, he accidentally shot himself with one of those rifles in what one person described as a rather careless way. Now here in the Civil War, Barber was anything but careless during his wartime service. He not only sustained soldiers, but also joined them as what many affectionately called him as a fighting parson or a fighting chaplain. Certainly fighting men were needed on July 2nd. Confederates attacked the Union flanks, what they believed to be their vulnerable sides, succeeding in gaining ground at areas we now know as Devil's Den, the wheat field, and the peach orchard, all while they were stopped in their tracks at other locations, like Little Round Top and Cemetery Ridge, all on the Union right or left flank. Meanwhile, a Confederate attack later in the day tried to hit the Union right along the slopes of Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. If you were at the first program today, you would have learned about some of the Union troops who fought on Culp's Hill 163 years ago today. George Greene's 1,400 or so New Yorkers, holding off against a force that outnumbered them close to 4-1. And while they weren't able to keep all their ground, they still maintained a strong position on Upper Culp's Hill. Union commanders between the 2nd and the 3rd decided that night to stay and fight it out. In other words, to remain on the high ground they had positioned themselves in, but as a part of that plan, also to try to push out Confederate forces that had gained a foothold very close to their lines. And this would start along the Union position on Culp's Hill. On the right side of the Union line, the 1,400 New Yorkers of Greene's command were joined by 8,000 more colleagues from the rest of the 12th Army Corps. This included the 29th Ohio Infantry, along with their chaplain, Baptist minister Lyman Daniel Ames. Ames hailed originally from Vermont, but settled in Ohio. A chaplain for less than 5 months before Gettysburg, he was ill at the time of the battle, and actually came up to the field having to ride in an ambulance. But nevertheless, he still determined to try to serve his men as best he could. He accompanied the troops as they marched in the dark to reinforce the Union position on Culp's Hill. Then, getting a horse, he rode further to the south, to the 12th Corps Field Hospital at a location known as the George Bushman House and the George Bushman Farm. Throughout the morning fight on Culp's Hill, 6 to 6.5 hours of continuous fighting with wave after wave of Confederate forces against Union troops behind protective logworks, wounded soldiers began to stream down into the Bushman Farm. Ames kept careful note of the wounded that he found that day, hoping to write to a hometown newspaper and inform them the fate of their loved ones. He talked to wounded men. He prayed for them, and he prayed with them. Ames at that time did what he could, but he could not always successfully comfort the men. As he wrote in his diary, "The struggle of mind is often great when compelled to give up the hope of recovery." Ultimately, that sick chaplain stayed to help the more grievously wounded all the way until August 3rd, a full month after the conclusion of the fighting. He stayed with the 29th Ohio as they fought battles in the Western theater of action until the unit mustered out in June of 1865. He died in 1879 back in his native Vermont. The sacrifices of units of the 12th Army Corps, such as Ames's own regiment, helped to secure the Union right. Confederates retreated away in the late morning, forcing them to change their plans. The Confederate plan also ultimately became an attack on what was believed to be the vulnerable Union center, along Cemetery Ridge. But before the very famous events that have come down in history as Pickett's Charge or Longstreet's assault, fighting had already been going on along the Union center and its front. Since their arrival on Cemetery Ridge, Alexander Hayes's 3rd Division of the 2nd Corps had fought over the house and barn of the William Bliss family, and their arrival was early on July 2nd. 2 days of action, when on the morning of the 3rd, that division commander Hayes attempted to take the buildings one last time. One more push after sustained seesaw fighting between Union and Confederate skirmishers. For the task, Hayes turned to the small 14th Connecticut to do the work. As the Nutmeggers went forward, their 30-year-old Baptist chaplain Henry Smith Stevens stayed just behind the eastern edge of Cemetery Ridge. It wasn't long before Stevens was greeted by some of the wounded, one of the first being a young 19-year-old named Jeff Brainerd. Brainerd was nicknamed Little Jeff because of his short stature as well as his youth at the time. He was someone who, as Hayes ordered them to go forward and seize the Bliss properties, he shouted to his men, calling out, "Come on, you cowards!" Well, it wasn't long before he was shot through his chest and taken off to the rear. It was there that he saw Chaplain Stevens just behind the ridge when Little Jeff called out, "Oh, Chaplain, come here." As Stevens recalled, his frenzied grasp and the contortions of his countenance told the agonies of pain he felt. Wishing to draw him out, we, still holding his hand and stroking his forehead, said, "What should we think of you, Jeff?" With a startled expression, he looked up when he spoke. "Tell my mother. Tell my," and was gone. That's pretty heavy stuff right there. Well, little Jeff may not have made it to the Bliss House, but the soldiers of the 14th Connecticut did succeed in this effort. They took the house and soon felt the full force of a Confederate counterattack. Eventually, with such pressure, Alexander Hayes ordered the 14th to burn the house and the barn in hopes of keeping it out of the hands of Confederate forces. The 14th did just that. And when they had succeeded in their efforts, they moved back to Cemetery Ridge, facing off pretty soon against the Confederate cannonade of approximately 150 guns. Following that, the infantry assault of around 12,000 infantrymen would be set forward. An overwhelming show of Confederate force to try to pressure the U.S. forces and hit their vulnerable center. But instead of breaking through the Union lines in the sector of the 14th Connecticut, the Federals held off the attack in a sector that Confederates did not break through their stone wall defenses. Stevens stood just behind the line, ready to comfort the wounded and give some solace to the dying. He recalled one soldier who came up to him after the action, summing up how the 14th Connecticut fell that day. "I never knew our men to fight as they do today. They cannot be whipped." The bravery that Stevens spoke about won the battle for the Federal Army, who secured total victory when Confederate forces left on the night between July 4th and 5th. What Lee's armies left behind was a devastated field of battle. A field trampled by men such as Joseph Hopkins Twitchell. Twitchell was a 25-year-old Connecticut Yankee who graduated from Yale as well as the Union Theological Seminary. He became a chaplain in 1861, but regulations be darned, he did not actually become an officially ordained minister for 2 more years after that. Just around the Battle of Gettysburg did he have his full credentials. He was a Congregationalist minister in a primarily working-class Irish regiment, the 71st New York Infantry. During the battle, Twitchell tended to the wounded and even recalled dodging artillery shots in the relative safety of the Trossel Barn, which you could visit just before Tour Stop 11. After the fight, he, like Ames, remained with the wounded, tending to those who could not easily leave the field. Remaining gave him time to look out onto the aftermath of the struggle. As he recalled, "It was the most terrible battlefield I had ever beheld. The stench was almost unendurable, and the dead lay everywhere. In one place more than 30 were gathered together, and the look of their bloated, blackened corpses was a thing to murder sleep." Twitchell had to deal with such sights, such other occurrences that murdered his sleep, until July 1864, when he eventually left the Army. Afterwards, he became a prominent writer and pastor, and an incredibly close friend to Samuel Clemens, an author more commonly known by the pseudonym, anyone want to guess? Mark Twain, right there. So there on the right-hand side, you could see old Mark Twain with even the white jacket. I guess it's more of a gray jacket, but we'll call it white for now. And then Twitchell right there off on the left in older age. Eventually, that left-hand figure, Twitchell, passed away in Connecticut in 1918, 8 years after his famous friend. Another chaplain who wrote about the aftermath of battle was a 28-year-old Thomas Vassar, the chaplain of the 150th New York. And I know we have some fans of the 150th New York in the audience. All 5 of us out there, that's okay. So Vassar, pictured here on the right in older age, came from Dutchess County, New York. His original plans were to attend college, but a series of financial misfortunes in his family led him to instead study for the ministry. In 1857, he was officially a Baptist minister. A few years later, in October 1862, he joined the ranks of the 150th New York, spending much of his first year on garrison duty around Baltimore. It wasn't until the late spring, early summer of 1863, when the 150th was attached to the Army of the Potomac, and specifically the 12th Army Corps. They faced battle not just on the July 3rd Culp's Hill fighting, but also the day before as Union reinforcements helping to plug the Union gaps along Cemetery Ridge. So 2 days of fighting that Vassar's men were a part of. And while this chaplain did not record what he did during this 2 days of action, in a letter to a hometown newspaper, he described how much of a major role he took in the aftermath. "I superintended the burial of the dead of the 150th, Vassar said. Close by the edge of the woods, we dug their graves. The flicker of the dying campfires streamed up amid the deep darkness as we wrapped around our heroes their blankets for a winding sheet and silently laid back, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust." Vassar's recollections remind us that chaplains not only prepared men to fight and recover, but also helped them after they had died. After the war, he became a Baptist minister in New York, Massachusetts, Missouri, and New Jersey. It was in New Jersey in 1918 that he passed away, the same day as his Connecticut comrade, Joseph Twitchell. As the stories of these veterans have shown, the Battle of Gettysburg did not end the American Civil War. The conflict continued for 2 more years. Some of the chaplains made it to the very end. Most did not. But even if they left the ranks early, soldiers remembered their service. Chaplains' unique positions as leaders, without having to issue orders or commands, gave them a very unique and often untold position, one that allowed them to get to know the men and serve as a link between the home front and the war front. After the fighting ceased, these men continued to tell their comrades' stories. They did so by attending reunions, joining veterans groups, and praying at monument dedications. Additionally, chaplains authored around 20%, by my count, of all Union regimental histories written during and after the war. 9 of those chaplain officers were here at Gettysburg, including Henry Stevens and the chaplain of one of my favorite units, the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry, pictured here, the Reverend Alonzo Hall Quint. But chaplains were not just the authors of post-war memory. They also could be the center of recollection. And this brings us back to the beginning of the talk, when we talk about who gets remembered in the monuments, tablets of the battlefield. Chaplains may be rarely remembered by us in the Civil War context today, but veterans of the Civil War certainly wanted their service to be remembered and honored. This fact is reflected by the presence of the 2 chaplain monuments on the Gettysburg battlefield. In 1888, the soldiers of the 90th Pennsylvania Infantry put up a monument to Horatio Howell at the steps of Christ Lutheran Church, just where he was assassinated by the Confederate soldier. The keynote speaker of that day, calling the event a worthy and honorable, a grateful act, accurately referred to that monument as the first monument that has been set up on a battlefield to perpetuate the memory of a chaplain slain in battle. Well, in 1910, another monument went up, this time to a chaplain who survived the battle and survived the war, erected to honor Father William Corby's famed absolution. The sculptor for this structure was a gentleman named Samuel Aloysius Murray, the same exact person who designed all of the different statues on the Pennsylvania Memorial. The keynote speaker that day called the structure a silent testimonial to the highest and truest patriotism, the patriotism of Catholic manhood. And so you could see with the legacy of some chaplains, arguments being made for a particular denomination and its belonging in the United States. A year after this monument was erected, the Corby one, now in 1911, the University of Notre Dame erected a copy on its campus. And so, chaplains are relegated to footnotes in the books and monuments that tell about the history of the Battle of Gettysburg. I hope you leave today recognizing that they deserve more than that. That their diverse experiences tell a story of individuals who adapted to the needs of their men during, before, and after the different battles. Most of the time, these men didn't fight directly, but their services sustained the men who engaged in this battle 163 years ago today. This was something that the keynote speaker in the 1888 dedication of the Howell Monument wanted to drive home, in words that I hope to end my program with today, and that I hope that all stick with you as you travel around and enjoy the rest of the anniversary programming. The chaplain, like the rest, gave up his home, his family, and himself to the work and privations of the Army. It was the chaplain's part to take and bear, as the pastor of his regiment, a burden of care and responsibility that called out all of his sympathies and often wrung his heart. It was his not to repress and stifle these sympathies, largely as officer and surgeon must do. It was his alone to allow them scope and activity as he helped his men morally and religiously. And so with that, folks, I'd like you to thank you all for coming out here today. Thank you.